Okay. How's that? Are we good? Are we good? Okay. Now we should have sound. Let's move this mic over here so I'm a bit clearer. Uh, we should be going. Okay. So, since I'm assuming most of you couldn't read what I said, hello and welcome. My name is Kyle Cush. I am the archive technician here at the Lakes Historical Society, and I'm broadcasting live from a brand new 3-monitor setup. I just got in the door about 6 minutes ago, so it's probably why things are a bit rushed. This is the traditional territory of the Snipes Nation, so I should acknowledge that. And good, we're good to go. That's awesome. This is the Gene Spicer collection, and this was originally the second slideshow that we ever did back in October of 2015. And this is one of the longer shows that we did as well. This is 163 photos, all amazing color slides taken between 1954 and 1989 by Gene Spicer, who was the matriarch of the Spicer family of Spicer Farm fame. Also a member of the Waterfield family, another very prominent farming family here in the Cusp area. She was a remarkable artist, a remarkable photographer, a remarkable person in general. And her amazing photos were basically one of the prompts, along with the original Our Colored Past slideshows, for our book that came out in 2019, Our Colored Past. You've already seen a lot of her photos in that book. Today, I want to show you a even wider range of her collection. It wasn't just Arrow Lakes photos, as you'll see, but all over the Slocan and Lardo as well. And there's no time to waste. We're already, I'd say burning daylight, but it's 7:05 already. So, let's start, shall we? All right. Thanks for bearing with me as I get set up here. You can't you can't mention Gene Spicer without mentioning Spicer Farm, which her husband Chris purchased in 1948. They were married the following year. Their daughters Janet and Crystal came soon after, and they grew up on this idyllic 9-acre piece of paradise on the southeast edge of the village of the Cusp. And what a gorgeous shot this is. The Rainbow over Spicer Farm, 1956. I mentioned 1954, and of course 1954 was the last year of the SS Minto in the Cusp. And this is one of her earlier slides. This gives you a little idea. Of course, that's the Minto at the Cusp waterfront. And this gives you a little idea of what the waterfront looked like at the turn of the 60s, so just after the Minto went out of service. You see Spicer Farm at bottom, and then you see the industrial waterfront. Bay Street is the street that runs alongside the railroad tracks there. And of course, the railroad tracks wrapped all the way along the waterfront around the village in the Cusp. You see the Big Bend Celgar Mill, the beehive burner there at the top of the photo. That would cease operation the next year. You do notice all the log booms. That mill is basically on top of where the public beach is now, and then the old pole yard beyond that. It would, around this time, move to the north edge of the Cusp where it is now, and then you have the modern town site. You can just see the Leland poking out, the Leland Hotel poking out of the trees on the right-hand side. I mentioned Chris Spicer, and there's Chris Spicer working in the field at Spicer Farm, and with the mill going on in the beehive burner and all the smoke in the background. Chris Spicer was an agriculturalist, Oxford Y educated. It might have been Oxford as well. Y College in Oxford, something like that. And then Jean had a degree from UBC. Although It was the 1930s when she got her degree, and they refused to allow a woman, believe it or not, to have a Bachelor of Science. They gave her a Bachelor of Arts. Could you imagine that? More than unfair. But regardless, look at how verdant that farm field is, how plentiful. Pound for pound, acre for acre, that was one of perhaps the most productive produce farms in all of British Columbia. This is the one I used for the... similar to the one I used for the title card. Again, look at how rich that topsoil is. That topsoil was so rich because it was fed by an underwater spring. Well, an underground spring at the time. Now it'd be an underwater spring, unfortunately, as we'll get to. But immensely, deep, dark topsoil. There's the iconic barn, still there. And what a beautiful sight that is. I mentioned how productive it was. Here is Chris Spicer loading pumpkins into the old pickup truck. And he inherited the pickup truck when he bought the farm, because that is a pickup truck that used to belong to the Boisnel brothers, who were two brothers from Jersey in the Channel Islands that came to the cusp and farmed here for about 3 decades before the farm was sold to the Spicers. And originally, this farm was founded by Sam Henry, pioneer Chinese-Canadian businessman, who originally operated the laundry on the waterfront and slowly expanded into real estate. This property originally included the 2 blocks of houses in front of what is now the hospital and the land that the hospital is on. In fact, Chris Spicer donated the land for that hospital. Here he is making cider in a cider press. And look at that little Massey Harris tractor. And there's Gene milking a cow as a goose feeds from pail. A recurring theme of Gene Spicer is geese. There's actually a very amusing story of one of her pet geese flying away all the way to the lower mainland before being identified. It was actually, she and her sister Nancy were actually interviewed about this crazy runaway goose on CBC radio. And yeah, lots of pictures of geese in this collection, so I had to choose this one. That's like the geese are advancing on you. Ducklings in a flower patch. Just a cute little photo. There's Janet, and of course Janet now runs the farm and the other holdings that are part of the farming operation all around the cusp area. There are 27 different plots around the Arrow Lakes that she farms. Truly remarkable. And as you can see, she came by it honestly, and look how much cabbage there is. That is an awful lot of cabbage. Moving away from the farm into the town site, can anybody out there guess where this is? If you can picture yourself at the intersection of Highway 6 and the new truck route with Government Hill Road and Churchill Road looking northwest, then you'll put yourself right at this location. This is that intersection, and of course the bypass was built on top of the old CPR right-of-way. And there's a great shot of the train in action at that location. So that walking trail along the bypass is just to the left, down below. Here's a great shot of the MV Lardo sailing away from the Cusp waterfront in the fog of winter. And the Lardo is the ferry that replaced the Minto. It held 10 cars, and there was no highway to Revelstoke yet, so you had to take this ferry all the way from the Cusp to Arrowhead. A 50-kilometer journey. That's quite a long ferry ride. Another great shot. She loved taking photos of reflections, so this is a reflection at the north end of Upper Arrow Lake, near Arrowhead. So that's I don't know exactly what point that is. Could be Eagle Bay, could be Bannock Point. Here is Broadway Street as seen during the July 1st parade, 1956. And you can still pick out exactly where this is, because the Masonic building at the center is very distinctive. And you will notice the Broadway Cafe there next to it. That's where Selkirk College is now, so that building is no longer there. But the white building next to that, that is where Touch of Fashion is now. Some more parade photos here. There's tons of parade photos in the collection. Very valuable, because that's where you can see a lot of people of the village gathered, either watching or in the parade floats. And because there was so much participation back then, it's often our only shots of people. So I deeply appreciate parade photos, even though there are thousands of them. This is a great shot of a Wizard of Oz parade float in 1956. Parades always ended on top of the rec grounds, where Helen Zelsnick Park is now, and you can see the scoreboard up at the top right. This is a great shot. This is Marion Cusick riding in the bucket of a loader, carrying two fellows dressed up as a bull, it looks like. This is a butcher float, so you can see the now on that. And then here's the then that goes with the now, and that's Harold Doyle driving his old vintage car, which he would enter in the parades for decades. You can see the fellow reading newspaper in the back, and in the background, that's a fantastic shot of the Bluebird Cafe, where the Valley Food Store is now. Here is the intersection of Broadway Street and what is then Edith Avenue. It's now 2nd Avenue, and McCusk Glass would be in that vacant lot right in the background. Look how much effort went into decking out that McCusk Legion parade float, all that crepe paper. Pretty remarkable. Also notice the cool fingerboard street signs. This is an awesome shot. This is Hospital Auxiliary float, 1957. I really hope that when I'm in the hospital next time, we don't have a nurse taking a hacksaw to my foot. But 1958. We've seen photos of the Old West Bank robbery reenactment and other slideshows that was done for the BC Centennial that spring. Some of the best color shots, almost the only color shots that we have, come from Gene Spicer, who we know from other photos was standing directly adjacent to Pitcher Willie when she was taking these photos. That's the Masonic building, decked out to be the Northwest Mounted Police office. Look at that cool movie poster on the billboard in the back. The African Lion. This is looking from in front of the Masonic building, east down Broadway. You see the giant neon orange crush sign, which kind of ruins the Western aesthetic. But it is cool looking nonetheless. That's on the front of the Broadway Cafe. A very rare shot of horses tied up on Broadway. Before we had the modern Rothwell Point wharves, post-flooding, before that we had a set of wharves on the bay. This is where Salgar had their float planes, for example, and docked their tugs. And this is a great shot of the float planes. Here's what happened to those float planes when the storms kicked up on the lake. Men had to go in and push the seaplanes away from the dock so that the pontoons wouldn't get torn open on the sides of the dock. Also in that vicinity, Dave Duncan kept his float plane, and over the 50s and early 60s, Dave Duncan operated Arrow Lakes Airways. with this cool float plane there. And in the background, getting his gear on, is Chris Spicer, who probably wore that jacket for most of his adult life, because there are photos of him wearing it in 1990. Waste not, want not. This is a cool shot now as the plane takes off from a frozen upper Arrow Lake, a frozen Rothwell Bay. And of course, the lake really doesn't freeze anymore since the times of the dam. So it's a pretty rare shot. Solitary plane out on the ice. Looking back on the Cusp waterfront and the government wharf. So now our public wharf is at the edge of town. It used to be right in the dead center of the town. And at the head of the wharf, you can see the Canadian Pacific Railway Station. And then over to the right, you see the Leland Hotel on top, and then the Bow Vista Motel below it. And we'll get to the Bow Vista in a bit. This shot is so spectacular that Library and Archives Canada turned it into a postcard about 4 years ago. They actually asked us. They thought this shot was so cool. Could they use this for a postcard to promote the Documentary Heritage Program? And we said, absolutely. So some lucky people who have purchased books through us have actually received this photo as a postcard. At the time, most people would have called this Mount Halcyon, but it was at this time that it was officially renamed Mount Burnham, and then the smaller peak, because you notice it's Twin Peaks, was called Mount Grady. So Burnham for Fred Burnham of Halcyon Hot Springs, and Grady for Mike Grady of St. Leon Hot Springs. The actual Halcyon Mountain is on the other side of the lake, behind Halcyon Hot Springs. Here is, we see Chris and Crystal watching as a truckload of logs goes by on the back of a logging truck over the Kuskonax Bridge at the time. The highway bridge would come in at the end of the 60s with the arrival of Highway 23, but this bridge here was built in 1940, and it probably couldn't do much. It probably couldn't do much more than hold that truck. Pretty spectacular, and of course in the Cusp Canyon, Kuskonax Creek on the bottom. Speaking of logging trucks, this is logs being loaded at the Cusick and Sad Mill on the south edge of Nakusp. Also on the south edge of Nakusp. If you go south of Nakusp towards Crescent Bay, you'll drive very soon, quickly past Rothwell Point on your left-hand side, drive past a gravel pit. If you look closely on the gate, you'll see that it is called the Purcell Pit, and that is named after Purcell Lumber, which existed on that site at the end of the founded there in the latter half of the 50s, and a number of prominent Nakusp figures had ownership stakes in that lumber company, in that mill, including Bert Harridge, our longtime MP, and Erling Johnson, former mayor. And then Highway 6, as you can see, is about to be paved at this time for the first time. And then they'd have to move the highway 10 years later when they flooded. There were, up until the beginning of the 90s, there actually used to be a barge ferry that operated between Cape Horn and Fosthall. And of course, it was used strictly for forestry purposes, but here's a shot of the barge Kuskonax being pushed by the tug Arrow Number 1, which was the rechristened and refurbished MV Beaton, formerly the SS Beaton. So, in one way or another, that tug had been around since 1928. This is a great shot from the Arrow Park Ferry. a sign on the Arrow Park Ferry discouraging vandalism of the vessel. This is 3 Arrow Park ferries ago now. Mentioned the cabbage patch on the Spicer farm. Here we are looking out toward the lake, and that shows you the farm is right on the lake. Looking out towards the Selkirk Tug Liberty, which is out collecting stray logs and driftwood beachcombing to take back. And that's the Selgar office across Rothwell Bay in the background, right? The Spicers were such an outdoor family. They loved outdoor adventure. They went into every mountain range you could possibly think of within a couple 100 kilometers of Nakusp. And so there are some amazing alpine shots in this collection, as you'll see throughout the show. Here's a great shot of Saddle Mountain Lookout, and then Upper Saddle Mountain is at the left. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Upper Saddle Mountain is actually the higher of the 2 peaks on Saddle Mountain, not where the actual lookout is. But it shows you what a crazy hike it really is to get to the top of Saddle. That's Chris Spicer posing on top of Saddle Mountain Lookout. There, I just had to shut off that whatever's trying to do that ready to connect sound in the background. I apologize, everyone. And speaking of the hike up to Saddle Mountain, this is the Spicer family, so Chris and the girls, crossing a patch of snow on the Saddle Mountain Trail. Look how precipitous that is. That's a lot of rubble. A little bit better condition nowadays. But that's a pretty spectacular shot. Way down in the bottom, by the way, you can... Bottom right. You can see Kusinak's Creek Delta. I mentioned the Cusick and Sad Mill, south of Nakusp, Mars. Well, here are the kids taking a slide down a sawdust pile. They'd be pretty dirty after that. That's pretty awesome. And Spicer's at Fosthall swimming, and that boat in the background is still in the possession of the Spicer family to this day. Here it is there, with the girls taking a ride up a flooded logging road at the foot of Saddle Mountain. So again, this will be west of Mars, as people may have referred to it back then. Today we'd say the Bahamas. This is a great shot of the Spicers and their cousin, Chris Jr. This is the old Nakusp Hot Springs pool. So this is about... this is not too long after the original bathhouse had completely collapsed and the pool was open air again. If you... I think I would have shown it about 3 or 4 slideshows back, but there's a shot from the Ueda collection in 1959. You can still see the ruins of the bathhouse still enveloping the pool. Or 1956, sorry. So this is 7 years after that, and it's just the pool now. And those are the ruins that you now see when you go to the old Hot Springs site. I mentioned that Jean Spicer was a Waterfield before she was a Spicer. And this is where she grew up, on what was called the Assart in Crescent Bay. And of course the Waterfield family still very prominent in Crescent Bay to this day. Another goose shot. This is her 53rd birthday on the farm in 1962. And you can see how those hands are, how muscular they are from all those decades of working on the farm. Here's a family shot. This is from the 1967 parade. That's Crystal on the left, and then Ken and Gord Marshall on the right in the parade, riding 3 golden palominos. This is a fantastic shot. St. Leon Falls on St. Leon Creek, August 63. What's amazing is I have no idea how, but we still have almost no photos of the modern, quote-unquote, St. Leon pools. And we have none of the halfway hot springs pools. So anybody out there with some natural hot springs snaps, give us a shout. Here's the old hot springs, prior to the dam, the water was pumped out of St. Leon Hot Springs down a pipe for 2.5 kilometers down to the lakeshore, and then the pools were inside the gates of St. Leon Hotel. And what an amazing building that was. A great shot of sunrise over Box Lake, February 64. The highway's been paved for about 8 years by this point. 3 sisters in the background. And Rugged Peak. And here's pretty much the same view, a little higher up, 2 years later during summer. Nice bird's eye view of Box Lake. This is a shot along Browse Loop Road, Saddle Mountain high in the background. Saddle Mountain's very isolated compared to the other mountains around. All right, Trevor says he has hot spring shots. That's what I like to hear. Thank you, Trevor. But if you look at it on a satellite image, you'll notice that Saddle Mountain is kind of isolated from the rest of the mountains in the Monachies. It's not really part of any range. It's off on its own. What we would call a massif, a large piece of crust that got shuffled off on its own. So that's why it has so many peaks, for example. Here is a dandelion field along Shakespeare Road in Glenbank. Scalping Knife Mountain in the background, and then Mountain Meadow to the left, the big platform in the back. I mentioned 3 sisters before, above Box Lake, or behind Box Lake, above Summit Lake. Here's the view from the top. Yes, they climbed to the top of that. What an amazing shot this is. Some of you may know this from the book. There is no way I could not put this stunning shot in our Colored Past book. Absolutely fantastic. Speaking of Summit Lake, there are the twins again, standing in the marsh at the head of Wilson Creek, outflow of Summit Lake. Here's Ruth Waterfield and Betty Bjorklund skating on Summit Lake. Summit Lake still does freeze over, very much so. And you'll notice that sharp peak in the back, that is All's House Peak, and that is on the side of Box Mountain. 1964, so this is not too long after the ski hill at Summit Lake opens. That opened in 1960. No T-bar yet, and certainly not as developed as it would be even just a few years later. Dave Johnson's barn in autumn, west end of Summit Lake. This location might throw you off a bit because you can see the lake, but if it doesn't look familiar, that's because this is where Camp Valhalla is now, so it looks a lot different nowadays. Another fantastic winter shot. This is Burton, as seen from the Burton Bluffs, so the town site's off to the left, and then look how long the wharf is, 1. And then 2, in winter, look how narrow the river is. Today we just think of that all as lake, but it shows you how narrow the narrows of the Columbia River really were between the 2 original lakes. It really was just a wide, shallow river. And hence the name, The Narrows. And oh yeah, look where the wharf house is on the wharf, because that's how much the water would come up in the summer. 1967. This is the last high water flood year before the dam permanently changed the hydrology of the valley. And here is a flooded Highway 6, and cars still driving through it. And here's a car having to be rescued from said flood. I mentioned the Boa Vista Motel at the beginning when we saw that waterfront shot. And the Boa Vista Motel was moved before the flooding by BC Hydro to become apartments. And those are now the townhouse apartments across from the Hut Drive-In on Broadway Street in the Cusp. To get the motel off the waterfront, they had to switch back at a long Bay Street, up Nelson Avenue, and onto Broadway that way. And of course, when you do that, that means you come right past the front gate of the Spicer Farm. So Gene Spicer has a great sequence of photos here showing the move. As you can see, it was a 4-star motel. Look at the shingle work on that hotel, by the way. Here are the lines crew lifting the hydro lines so that they can fit the motel under the power lines. And then here is the motel making its way through the intersection onto Broadway. And of course, a lot of townspeople coming to see what is a really monumental move. That is not a small building to relocate. Of course, the next year is when the leveling of the waterfront to create the modern erosion barrier to protect the rest of the Cusp from being eaten out from under by the fluctuating waters of the lake was created. At this time, they're still using the government wharf because the ferry is still going for another 2 years. So they still need that wharf, and the CPR workshop is still going to be there until April 1969. Another casualty of the flooding was the SS Minto, which had to be removed off the foreshore of the old John Nelson farm so that it wouldn't pose a hazard once the waters of the lake come up. And, of course, we all know about the Viking funeral. This is one of the last shots we see of the Minto in a pretty desperate state at this point. Actually still on land before it's towed out at the end of August 1st, actually. 1968 was the date of the burning. But yeah, a pretty sad shot. Here is the Bjorkland mink farm. Now, you'll notice at the top left, you see the corner of the Spicer's field. And then you have the new Highway 6 being constructed in the middle, and then the across the highway is the mink farm, and then you see all the mink pens in the bottom right. Looking the other way, from the other side of the farm, you can see the original Highway 6. This is taken all during the same flight, by the way, in 1968. You can see the original Highway 6 ran right along the lakeshore. And then you can see how lush and productive that the farm really was. And there you can see the topsoil where the farm was just 2 years later. And where that highway that ran, the roadbed from the highway that ran along that lake just 2 years later. And that desert that used to be Kusinak's Point. Yeah, it's a pretty stark shot. They would never dare to lower the lake this far anymore. It took them a while before they realized that drawing the lake down this far would not be very popular. Here it is 6 months later. It's not high water, but it's higher water. And you can see, for the this is the first appearance of that famous island that appears for about half the year or so. So I'll go back one, and you can see kind of where it is, and then contrast with this, where you can very much see where it is, and that there was actually a building on it still at that time. And then the new public wharf in the background. That Selgar building was the largest building moved during the flooding, by the way. They actually moved that entire building up about 200, 300 meters. What an undertaking. Of course, with all that open sand on the waterfront, cleared of vegetation, came dust storms. And that was always a dramatic event anytime the wind would pick up. Beginning in 1984, they started seeding those beaches, those sand expanses, so that the dust storms wouldn't nearly be so bad. This is 1974. This is the former Morton Ranch. This is where McDonald Creek Provincial Park would be established. 2 years after this photo is when the Legion first establishes a park. The province takes it over. It's McDonald Creek Provincial Park 6 years after that. You can see in the background that little sand spit that sticks out. That was where the West of Mars town site was. Contrast that. This caption is supposed to say 1989, not 1974. It gives you very much an idea of how much the shape of the shore changed in 15 years. So, I'll just do that, and then that way, for future reference. Another place that was affected by dam construction, but not for a few years after we were, was the stretch of the Columbia River between Mica Creek and Revelstoke, which would be flooded in the early 80s by the Revelstoke Dam. This is what it looked like in the 50s. As you can see, very steep canyon walls, which is why Lake Revelstoke isn't so wide, because it's very deep. Here's a stunning shot of a logging truck crossing a bridge on the Big Bend Highway. And of course, the Big Bend Highway was the predecessor of the Trans-Canada Highway before it was completed across Rogers Pass in 1962. You had to take a 300-kilometer detour all the way up to Mica Creek and then back down to Donald and Golden. And most of the Big Bend Highway is all underwater now, whether it's Lake Revelstoke or whether it's Kinbasket Lake. Kinbasket Lake was formed by Mica Dam. And here's a shot of the Mica Dam spillway. Mica Dam was completed in 1973. One of the largest earth-filled dams on the planet. Another victim of dam flooding were all of the pictographs along the Arrow Lakes. This was a pictograph on the cliffside at Cape Horn, shown in 1963, and now, because the water comes up and then goes down, comes up, comes down, it's very abrasive, and you can only imagine what it does to pigment. To be honest, I don't even know if you could see them on Cape Horn anymore. This is another even more vivid one. You can see the man holding fish. There's Cape Horn as seen from the north, 1959, and then compare and contrast with Cape Horn as seen from the south, sometime in the 1970s, 1980s, and you can see the water bleaching. So we're back down to about what the original water level is here in this one. So it's taken that low water, but you can see how much the water comes up during high water periods and how much leaching of minerals has occurred. So that is very dramatic. I mentioned before, the spicers went into every single mountain range you could imagine in the West Kootenay, especially in the Slocan. And they traveled to so many abandoned mine sites and active mine sites. Here's the entrance to one of the abandoned sites. That's the Antoine mine south of Zinkton. Look how quickly nature has reclaimed the portal entrance. Go back in time 16 years before that photo, and there are the spicers at the Antoine mine. And you can see how high up that is because the ridge top is right at the top of this photo. So they're pretty much as high as you can possibly go here. That's a derelict tramway tower at the Antoine mine. And you can see it's already starting to lean over. I talk about nature reclaiming things. Tailings piles and talus slopes can look fairly similar. So if you didn't know what to look for, you might not know that the lump in the foreground is not a talus slope, it is a tailings pile. Whereas the one on the right, in the background more, that's very obviously a talus slope because you can see it's sort of a result of rocks falling as opposed to rocks being piled. But it blends in well with the alpine, for better or worse. Speaking of the alpine, this is a little alpine pond below Brennan Ridge, which is near Italic. This is in 1980. This is a cool shot. It's the portal at the Dardanelles mine, and it's filled with ice. And you can see where it's actually melted from the top of the portal and come down a bit. But it's also August. The fact that it's still there in August gives you an idea of how high they are and how sheltered that chunk of ice would be from the elements being inside the mine portal. This is from Flint Mines. This is on Mount Carlisle, west of Caslow. You can see the ruins of the tram line there, that old ore car. In case you couldn't tell, it was at Flint Mines. Flint has been spray painted on the side of it. You can see that old cabin with an old gold pan on it. That cabin belonged to Lockie McPherson. And this is a shot of Lockie McPherson in 1985, Mount Carlisle. There's the summit of Mount Carlisle, looking very mystical in the clouds there. Not a piece of vegetation to be found. Pretty high up, of course. This is the Highland Surprise Basin. This is northeast of Vertala. And stunning alpine view. Chris and Crystal having lunch on Lyle Creek, northeast of Retallick. And Lyle Creek is the creek that you drive over as you're leaving Retallick, heading towards Caslow. And then the Highland Surprise Basin again, seen from Whitewater Mountain, north of Retallick. Whitewater Creek is another creek that flows past Retallick. In fact, Retallick's former name was Whitewater. Not to be confused with the Whitewater Ski Resort, south of Nelson. Give you an idea of how far you can see when you're on top of a mountain. This is the view from the Idaho Peak summit. And way in the background, just right of center, you can actually see Mount Fosthall in the Monashee Mountains, which would be 100 kilometers away. Well, as you drive, 100 kilometers away. As the bird flies, maybe about 60, I suppose. Zinkton. This is an interesting procession of shots, as you'll see. This is Zinkton in 1967, and a lot of the buildings are still there. They're all pretty much empty at this point, but they're all still there. That's the Lucky Jim mine on right. Here it is, 1967. Suddenly, a lot of those buildings have collapsed. The mine is starting to fall over, but it hasn't fallen over yet. And you can see all the private property keep out painted on the side of the building. That's 1971. Here's 1979. As you can see, now the vegetation's really started to attack all these buildings, and the front of the mine, front of the concentrator's just fallen off completely. And now, if you were to go there, you'd see just the base foundation of that. You barely notice it from the highway. Here's the Noble 5 mine at Cody. And it's still looking pretty neat here. Whoever varnished that place did a pretty good job, because even though, if you look closely, it is starting to fall apart here, the actual varnish job is still very intact. If you go to the veranda, here's a porcupine. And that's just a cute shot. That is Janet sitting atop the ruins of the Rambler mine. This is Relocation Mountains, south of Zinkton, in between Zinkton and Sandon. That's the bunkhouse of the Rambler, as seen from the road to the Antoine mine. And this is looking way up from the road. This is actually quite zoomed in. So it's a pretty remote location. Again, some of these views are just ridiculous how stunning they are. That's the Rico Ridge north of Cody. Getting into the Lardo here, this is the Hall Creek Valley. This is way north of Hauser, so you're driving up the Duncan River Forest Service Road quite a bit now. And I don't know if you know this, but you can drive like 100 kilometers up that road. You pretty much almost get to the back end of Glacier National Park. This is Abbott Peak, north of Hauser. Having an interest in geology, as I mentioned her UBC days before, Gene Spicer always liked to search for different rock formations in her photos. So she took there's a dozen photos at least mark Limestone Dike. Limestone Dike. A dike is rock intrusion. And so you can see those dikes sticking out of the mountain. Everything else eroding around it. And a little glacier on top of the mountain there. Speaking of rocks, here's the Marblehead Rock Quarry. I'm sure a lot of you here have been by there if you've been through Meadow Creek. You go 13 power poles past the north end of Meadow Creek. You'll come into the rock quarry. And you can drive right up in there. This is before all the graffiti took over. So it's a pretty rare shot. Ore cars at the Utica mine northwest of Caslow. Good chance those ore cars are still there. Patty Peak, Utica Lake. And this is a really cool shot. I mentioned Whitewater Creek. Here's, at the head, Whitewater Glacier. And here's Chris and Janet walking on top of the glacier. Linger on that one for a bit. Whitewater Creek coming down from the glacier through the meadows. This one's just a nice little cheeky shot. Chris Spicer sitting atop atop a large boulder at Utica Mine. And we saw Janet Spicer at the Rambler Mine a few shots ago. Here she is at the Viola Mac Mine, south of Three Forks. When one thinks of Retallick, they often think of those iconic old houses still there along the roadside. Yeah, here they are. It snowed a little that winter. That's 1964. This is 1979. And by 1979, they pretty much look how they do to this day. Still private property, still being maintained. We all know this shot. As you come into Sandon, you go past the mine mill there. And it's had different names over the years. Carnegie, Dickinson, Klondike. But still in operation most of the time. Chris Spicer at the door of the residence of Gene Peterson. And Gene Peterson was one of the longest resident people of Sandon. Some of you may be familiar with his autobiography, which was published back in the 80s, I think. I know we have a copy at the archives. But yeah, very distinctive looking door. This is Carpenter Creek, downtown Sandon, 1970. You still see all the debris left over from the Great Flood washout of 1955 that basically sealed Sandon's fate. A few more buildings than there are now. A lot of those buildings were being pilfered for lumber around this time. But there's the City Hall, and that's where the Prospector's Pick is now, in the refurbished City Hall. It gives you a really good shot of the side of the flume that used to contain Carpenter Creek prior to the washout. This is the Virginia Block. This is one of those buildings that was pilfered for lumber. So unfortunately it's no longer there. But a great shot of the Virginia Hotel, built 1900. And to its left you see the old Slocan Mercantile Building. And that's where the Sandon Museum is today. And you'll notice the building faces the creek because for those who don't know, the reason it was flumed is because Main Street, Sandon, was built on top of Carpenter Creek because there's so little room in the narrow valleys of Carpenter Creek that contain the town that they had to take what they could get, and so they actually turned the creek into a main street, which is why you walk around the building from the road to get into it today. Silversmith Mine, way up on top, and then the Tin Cup Cafe, which we would sadly lose to fire. But I definitely remember that from when I was a kid. A great shot of Slocan Lake at Silverton. Again, she loved her reflection shots. Here's the Standard Mine Mill on the Silverton waterfront in the 1960s. Of course, this is a residential area. That's where some of the newer houses in Silverton will be found on top of this old mine site. The old concentrator. Here's the ruins of some waterworks on New Denver Canyon, Carpenter Creek. Here's New Denver Glacier, as seen in the distance. So the Valhalla's way in the back. That valley, that would contain Slocan Lake, and then you're looking from Mount Brennan north of Retallick. Further down the Slocan Valley, things get a bit less dramatic, but it's still no less beautiful. This is Frog Mountain. Some of you might even know this very exact curve along Highway 6 between Winlaw and Passmore. This is the Wingy Farm. The Wingy Farm during the 80s and 90s was very famous for the collection of vintage farm machinery that used to be on display along the roadside. Oh yeah, hi Anitra, if you're watching. Here's the Spicer family sitting on the beach at the Hauser Wharf, back when Duncan Lake was much smaller than it is now, prior to the construction of the Duncan Dam. This is a great shot of the Canadian, one of the flagship trains of the CPR. This is 1960. What a cool looking train. And then you can see the field train station off at right. And it's named after a man named Cyrus Field. It's not named just because the town's in a field. Or it's named after a person named Field. Here's an old farmstead along the Slocan River. Not sure exactly where along the Slocan River this is, but you can see... I'm guessing these buildings probably aren't there anymore. Already decent state of disrepair by the time this photo was taken. This is a great shot. A few shows back, I showed a shot of the Perry Creek store, Perry Siding, that the Stushinoff family had. Well, here it is in 1977. And you might not even realize it's a store, except if you look very closely in the window, you can see a Pepsi Cola sign. But this is the old Perry Creek store at Perry Siding. This is now, this is at Brilliant, north of Castlegar. And this is now where the USCC Cultural Center is. So it's still being... used by the community. This is Caslow Bay, 1979. All the cool boathouses there, and then the village of Caslow on the ledge in the background. The SS Moye would be around the corner on the other side of that ledge, which is why you don't see it here. We're looking from the north side of town south. Kokanina Fish Trap, Meadow Creek spawning channel. How cool is this shot? A bunch of redfish spawning in the creek bed. Here's John Street in Trout Lake, 1969. 1969 is kind of... We're at the nadir of Trout Lake's existence. We're about 15, 20 years away from the next wave of recreational property owners. We're looking at the intersection of Highway 31 south into the town site. So if you're standing at the front of the... on the highway in front of the general store looking south across the intersection, this is that same view, and those houses are still there. They're in much better condition now. Here's the back of Kelly Street as seen from Vancouver Street, and you can see it's like it has this overgrown feel that you don't have nowadays, as much of this has been redeveloped. A lot more maintenance going on. There's a lot more people in town now, but a lot of these houses, again, still there, and those are houses that date back decades to the beginning of the 20th century almost. The Mini Marlowe House, this is not there, but stood for right up until the early 2000s, in between Trout Lake and Stobart Lake. west of the Trout Lake town site. This was meant to be a CPR station, Canadian Pacific Railway station, but the railway never got built to Trout Lake, so it was repurposed as a house, and that was the Marlowe family house for many decades. This is a great shot of the legendary John Nelson of Galena Bay, the longest lived resident of Galena Bay, who came there in 1901 and passed away in 1968. And of course, famous for, perhaps most famous for being the owner of the SS Minto. But what a great shot. Silence is golden. And of course, the Spicer family would have known many of the pioneer residents of the area. North of Beaton is the ghost town of Camborne, which was built around what was eventually known as the Sunshine Lardo Mine. It was the Oyster Criterion Mine, the Meridian Mine, and then the Sunshine Lardo Mine. Sunshine Lardo went bankrupt at the end of the 50s, thereabout. So this is what the mill and classifier looked like after being abandoned for about 18 years or so. Highway 6. Yeah, it's a lot easier going across the Monashee now than it was in 1958, that's for sure. Look at that, barely get one car through. That's the Spicer car driving across the snow-covered Monashee Pass. One thing that hasn't changed about Highway 6 is all the cattle that you can come across. This is a herd of Charlie Flick's Snowlander cattle, a breed of cattle that he actually created on his snowshoe ranch north of Edgewood, up in the Oakland Valley. He tried to engineer a type of cattle that could endure the harsh winters of the Monashee, and he succeeded and actually won awards for it, as you can see by how thick the fur, how thick the hair is on the cattle. This is a great shot of 3 bighorn sheep, Sinclair Canyon in Kootenai National Park. So, Kootenai National Park, of course, Radium Hot Springs. And Sinclair Canyon is that awesome canyon that you drive through on your way from the town site to the springs. Don't know exactly where this is. It's most likely East Kootenai. But in any event, it's a crazy shot of a brown bear just walking the highway, pacing the highway. More sheep. Coming back to the cusp here, I right now am broadcasting on the other side of the alley from this building. Of course, this building does not exist anymore. This was the old parish hall, more commonly known as the Small Hall. It was built in 1898 to serve as a community hall for Nakusp. Over the decades, once the Legion Hall was built, Legion Hall was bigger, it could hold more people, so the Small Hall slowly lost its function, but it still operated as a community hall right into the 60s. The library at one point was located on the top floor before moving into the current building. This, after it was the Small Hall, became a second-hand store called the Trading Post, and it operated as that for not quite a decade or so. On the left, you see a little annex. That's actually the original location of the Lord Minto. It was there for about a year before moving next door. This building was demolished in 1977, and the next year, the current BC liquor store was built. And that's, so it is going to be our liquor store is going to be 45 years old next year. You can see in the background is the Legion on the left. left, and the Arrow Lakes Theater on the right. And then I would be in the building tonight, just off to the right. I'm at the back of our studio. Here is the back of Sean's Bike and Ski, where the old Opera House was. This is a great shot of an Ogopogo snow sculpture. Think about the time and effort it took to not only make that, but to dye it. Because it's hard to tell because of the contrast, but it is dyed green. This is during the Arrow Lakes Winter Follies, which was, I think it was founded in '68, and it went through the early '70s, so it was around for about 5 years, and it was an annual winter carnival. Events here in the Cusp and also at Summit Lake, snowmobile races and skiing. There is even a parade, and as you can see here, snow sculptures. There's another shot of the MV Lardo, the ferry that we saw at the beginning of the show. And this is at the Galena ferry landing. Now notice I don't say Galena Bay. The original Galena ferry landing was on the north side of the Thumb. You actually drove from the Galena Bay town site across the Thumb Peninsula to the north side. And then off in the distance you can see what looks like a few buildings glistening in the background. That's Arrowhead. So you would catch the ferry from Galena Bay and go to Arrowhead. The ferry would start at the Cusp, go make its landings at Halcyon and St. Leon, or St. Leon then Halcyon, and then it would stop at Galena Bay, here. Then it would go over to Beaton, and then it would come up to Arrowhead that way. And from there, you would drive to Sidmouth, catch another ferry, and from there you could drive up to 12 Mile, where Blanket Creek is, catch another ferry, then finally you could drive up the east side of the Columbia River to get to Revelstoke. So yes, you had to take 3 ferries to get from the Cusp to Revelstoke. Now you only have to take 1. Isn't that nice? This is a great shot. The launching of the Captain Sutherland, which is the main tug for hauling log booms on the Arrow Lakes to this day. It's sort of become a local icon, I would say, over the past 5 decades. I think everybody likes it if they're on the Needles Ferry and they can see Sutherland off in the distance towing a massive log boom behind it. As I mentioned, even though much of the Spicer farm, the original Spicer farm, was lost, the farm remains in operation to this day. Here's a great shot of the Spicer farm garden right along the lakeside, looking out towards Rothwell Bay and the Selgar Wharf. And of course, you cannot come to visit the Cusp without taking a walk along the waterfront walkway past the Spicer Garden. Originally, it didn't have a name. Rose Garden, the Rose Arbor, because of the great arbor in front of it. But Chris and Jean Spicer, they were the ones that volunteered their time to maintain it. And so, eventually, it was named for them. This is a great shot of it in its original form back in 1974. You'll notice the walkway is not paved. There's just the railing. Another shot of the garden. 1981. 1983. This is another shot from Saddle Mountain, looking back toward the Cusp. Glenbank is at center, and Browse is at right. All those farms in the background there. And then you're looking at the valley of Kooskanax Creek. This is a dear friend of the Spicers, Emil Nobrand. And there is New Brand Road named in Upper Browse for him. That road will lead you to Twin Lakes, where one of the plots that Janet Spicer farms to this day is located, and that's the old New Brand property. Look at the size of this giant cedar. It's rather remarkable. Especially since it's completely hollow in the middle. And that's Chris Spicer and Emil Newbrand snowshoeing below Kuskonax Mountain. February 97. Or 77, sorry. Another thing that happened in 1977, the famous Cal Tire sinkhole, where the Seventh-day Adventist Church parking lot is now. And it caused quite a stir because nobody knew what it came from at first. There were articles suggesting that the entire town was in imminent danger of collapsing because it was on unstable glacial talus. But it turns out it was just because the water table got tapped into by the drilling of a well 2 blocks up the street. So it just drained the spring that was under it. This location is right next door to where the original spring where Nakusp residents got their domestic water from for 25 cents a barrel from Thomas Abriel. There's the Selgar Wharf surrounded by ice. Rothwell Bay. Again, looking from the Spicer Farm. And that's the Sutherland right in the middle there. John Finch docking the Selgar tug Asitka at the Spicer Farm. This tug still exists. It is no longer called the Asitka. Crosley and Sean Coates refurbished it and rebuilt it and named it the MV Ichiroshi Ino after one of its former workers, who, of course, we're all very familiar with if you watched any of these slideshows here. Nakusp's most famous photographer, whose day job was working for Selgar on the tugs. And that tug is now park up in the industrial area of Nakusp, as you can see from 13th Ave as you drive towards the modern shipyard. There is the Canadian Pacific Railway locomotive at Slocan Lake. 1977, of course, the train ran until 1988. And speaking of 1988, so here we are, the last year of that the train actually came through Nakusp. That is the smoke from a controlled burn on top of Box Mountain, as seen from Nakusp. And if you look up at Box Mountain to this day, you still see that block where this burn took place. It has grown in a bit, but it's still readily noticeable. More cool storm shots, this time in winter. Very eerie shot. This is a great shot of a Spicer Farm hayride in Canada Day, 1986. Rod Eel is driving the tractor, pulling the load of Spicer's hay. And there's Janet there. In another farm field, like I said, to replace the amount of produce they got from the original farm, they took up 24 plots around the Arrow Lakes to make up. And I mentioned the geese at the beginning of the show, so I figured I had to end it with geese. 1989. Just a great shot. So, amazingly, we fit 163 photos in about 70 minutes, guys. So I thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Apologies for the beginning. Like I said, I didn't get into the building until about 6:54. So it's a very quick setup. We've got 2 more slideshows coming up for you this season. Well, technically 1 more slideshow and 1 more movie night. Next March, which is going to be, again, as always, the 3rd Friday in March. So this is March 18th. So March 18th, mark your calendars for our next show, Get Out of Town. it's a little bit of a departure because we're the Arrow Lakes Historical Society, and so we keep material on the Arrow Lakes. But when you have as many photos as we do, sometimes in whether it's a roll of negatives or a set of slides or whatever, a photo album, you wind up inadvertently collecting a bunch of photos from outside of your region. And we've got a lot of pretty cool, neat, and interesting photos from around the world, honestly, in our collection. So next month's show is going to be all material from outside the Arrow Lakes. So mostly from other parts of BC, but also from the prairies, some even from Europe. So I think you'll enjoy that. You'll get a kick out of it. And again, there'll be lots of stunning scenery shots in that one because that's where Milton Goddard's BC Parks collection comes in handy, and the Hufty Hewitt collection has a lot of great aerial shots of the Kootenays. So you'll appreciate that. And then in April 15th, will be the long-awaited sequel to our very first movie night. So this will be the second half of the Ichiroshi Ino films. I've already got it edited. It's already ready to go. You just gotta wait 2 months to see it. But I have a feeling that even before that, you might get a little teaser of what to come. So keep an eye out on the YouTube channel because I spent 3 days this week digitizing a bunch of camcorder footage of from the late 80s and early 90s. So even though we'll take a summer off from slideshows, as we usually do, there'll still be lots of stuff going up on the YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that starting in April. But March 18th, we'll be back for another slideshow. As I mentioned, it's called Get Out of Town. So we hope to see it all there. And I thank you so much for bearing with me, and thank you so much for watching. And we'll see you March 18th. Have a good one, everybody. Good night.